I'm John Batchelor. Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes, joins me, and we join Gordon Chang, Forbes.com contributor and an analyst of the aggression of the People's Liberation Army Navy in East Asia, the aggression of the Chinese Communist Party. You will recall that the PLA works, obeys, is obeisant to, is a slave to the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people. This isn't the People's Army. This is the Communist Party's army. It's Xi Jinping's army and Navy and Air Force. Gordon, a very good evening to you. We'll get to the U.S. sending a B-52 bomber over South Korea, whether that's an adequate response to the provocation of a claim of an H-bomb test. I begin with this report from Xinhua News Agency that Chinese President Xi Jinping has ordered Beijing's 4 military organs to come up with new agencies. Why? He wants a reshuffling, so-called. He wants a stronger military. He wants to focus on winning wars and fighting battles. Gordon, is this bureaucratic double talk? Or is something changed in Beijing? Where did the peaceful rise go? What is she doing allowing this into Xinhua? Good evening to you, Gordon.
Good evening, John and Thaddeus. Chinese leaders have always talked about winning wars, but under Xi Jinping, the current ruler, there has been an increasing emphasis in talk like this. The talk has gotten more bellicose, and so this is not just boilerplate statements that any Chinese leaders will make. This really is an indication and a message from Xi Jinping that the Chinese military, in fact, has to get ready for war. And therefore, it is worrying and troubling, much more so than statements that we heard under Hu Jintao, his predecessor, or Jiang Zemin before that. This is really different.
The U.S. Navy is noticing this. And before I turn you over to my colleague, Mr. McCotter, I note in a report from the Hindu, this is from the subcontinent, Admiral Scott Swift, U.S. Pacific Fleet Commander, asks why the Chinese are deploying submarines on anti-piracy missions. He says, it's hard for me as a maritime commander to understand how can a submarine support anti-piracy operations. That's a practical question, Gordon. China knows that the U.S. commander is anxious about this, or do they want him to be anxious? Is this passive aggression by the PLA Navy?
Yeah, Swift's comments are important, not because what they say about China, because China has actually been deploying submarines on these Somali anti-piracy missions for quite some time. But what's significant is that you have a 4-star Navy admiral, and I'll go back to the Navy aspect of this, but what's significant is you've got a 4-star Navy admiral talking about this in public. You go back 2-3 years, the Chinese were doing some really aggressive things on the South China Sea and East China Sea, and American admirals wouldn't say anything. And I think what's happened is that inside the Navy, they realized that it was a mistake for them to remain quiet about this, because what they signaled to Beijing was that the Chinese could just run over the U.S. Navy. And that's why we've got problems. So yes, the Chinese are villains, but we permitted them to be so. And I think that it's really important for Swift to say these things, because it's signaling to Beijing, we are now willing to talk about this in public, because we are willing to confront you. This is important.
That is?
Gordon, yes, we've seen the U.S., the commander of the Pacific Fleet, make those statements. What have our allies done in response? I believe that Japan and others are doing flights with a certain type of aircraft to send a message, stopping at different points on their way back from anti-piracy missions. What are our allies doing in conjunction with the United States?
Well, now, for instance, you mentioned the Japanese. They are regularly working with the U.S., much more so in the past. And also the Japanese have talked about actually extending their operations into the South China Sea, which is far from Japan's most southern island. So this is really at the urging of the United States that they take a much more active role in defense of the region. And the Japanese are now working not just with us, we're treaty allies with them, of course, but they're also working with Australia and India. So the significant thing is that you have basically New Delhi and Tokyo working together to provide security in the seas around China. And Beijing is absolutely furious about this.
to Korea, the Korean Peninsula, the provocation of a claim of an H-bomb test. In any event, it was an atomic weapon, the fourth atomic weapon tested by a rogue state that abuses sadistically its own people and is incapable of conducting itself as a sovereign power. Gordon, the B-52, a so-called nuclear-capable B-52 bomber, based out of Guam, flies over South Korea. The North Korean newspaper dutifully responds, claiming the U.S. is bringing all of us to the brink of war. Is this an answer to the test? Is this an answer to China? How to interpret this? Because it looks like escalation, and now we go back to our corners.
Yeah, the United States did this certainly in response to Wednesday's test of a nuclear device. We also did this right after the 2013 detonation of a North Korean bomb. And so this has been a sort of a consistent way for the United States to show resolve. And we do this not because we think it's going to stop the North Koreans from their nuclear weapons program or their long-range ballistic missile program. We do this to assure the South Koreans, who are quite nervous these days. And so this is more like alliance management than anything else.
Thaddeus?
Gordon, it may be alliance management, but the question that I have relates to someone in that neighborhood who is behaving very badly lately. Some people will claim that the Chinese regime is very happy to have this distraction arise, to take the West focus away from their own aggressive actions towards its neighbors and within the South China Sea. Or is this, in fact, something that Beijing is angry about because it complicates those very plans?
Well, I think the answer, paradoxically, is both, because right now in Beijing you have a number of strains of thoughts in the senior leadership. And, of course, the Chinese don't like the idea of the North Koreans having the bomb because that diminishes China's power. And also the Chinese know that the North Korean bombs can actually be launched towards Beijing as well as towards Washington. But also, though, I think that still you find many senior generals and admirals actually like the North Koreans doing this because for the reasons you mentioned, it diverts us, it makes us go to Beijing and ask for help, and the Chinese, of course, extract concessions when we do that. So I think that this is very much, there are people in Beijing who have both views. And the important point here is that although a lot of people correctly say that the Chinese are moving in the right direction, there still is no consensus in a consensus-driven bureaucracy to change long-held pro-North Korean policies. And so Beijing is continuing to support Pyongyang despite what many people in Beijing thinks is a counterproductive policy for China.
There's a lack of trust in the leadership. Xi Jinping's leadership, Gordon. It's not just in military affairs or how he's dealing with North Korea. It's in the markets as well. You've written about this most recently, and I note the Wall Street Journal is featuring it right now. Global investors worry about Beijing's management. Something's gone wrong in the bargain. We'll leave you to be bullies, and you take care of your government. There's no longer any confidence that Beijing can rule.
Yeah, Beijing, Chinese technocrats were once revered around the world, but that changed last year when we saw the ham-fisted response to this stock collapse starting in mid-June, and also a self-inflicted wound regarding the devaluation of the renminbi on August 11th. And what we saw last week was another example of very incompetent leadership of their economy. On Monday they had the stock market plunge. The last thing they should have done was to cause problems of confidence, but that's exactly what they did on Thursday when they drove the value of the renminbi down, and they caused a second stock market collapse in the same week. I'm no optimist about Chinese leaders, but I actually thought that they would be keeping things calm for at least a couple months. And clearly they couldn't hold themselves back for 3 days. So people around the world in the global financial community are now very concerned about the ability of the Chinese leaders to manage their own economy and their own financial system.
Thaddeus?
Gordon, isn't this inevitably how such regimes end? You talked about the Chinese technocrats being revered around the world because they oppressed their workers into line so the West could make a buck. Isn't that type of admiration the very thing that we saw in the economically depressed 1930s where Mussolini made the train on time and fascism worked?
Yeah, I think there's a certain amount of that, and we got to be ashamed of what certain American corporate leaders have been saying about China. And it ranges from the naive to the completely malicious. But I think right now we are starting to see a reassessment of that, because it's clear that Chinese technocrats have really lost the playbook. They lost it last week. They've lost it starting, as I said, going back to the middle of last year. And right now, there's real concern among many in the financial community about what's going to happen. Not because the system is unmanageable, but because Chinese leaders can't manage it. And Thaddeus, the important thing here is that the crises are coming at shorter and shorter intervals, which indicates that China's going to fall off the cliff. Somebody once said, this is like a popcorn in a microwave. For a long time, you don't hear anything, so you assume nothing is happening. You hear one or two pops, and then all of a sudden, all the kernels pop at once, and you have crisis. This is exactly what's happening in China. I wish I'd come up with this metaphor. I didn't, but it's absolutely perfect.
Gordon, less than a minute. China's got money problems. It's got confidence problems. Does China do sneak attacks, Gordon? Do they do surprise attacks? Would they throw out something at the Japanese to distract us?
Yeah, absolutely. In August 2011, a Chinese general actually blurted out in public that his country was thinking of surprise missile attacks on the United States. We haven't paid attention to it, but we really got to consider the worst possible outcomes, because the Chinese leaders think of some pretty bad things when we're not looking.
Gordon Chang, Forbes.com contributors. Right now, the Chinese markets are at the bottom for the last year. They're just sitting there, hanging around. In the meantime, the aggression. Note the aggression. Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. I'm John Batchelor.